Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Marvin Kalb, director of the Shorenstein Center on the Press, Politics, and Public Policy here at the Kennedy School. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this forum. We're calling it Public Opinion, the Press, and the Clinton Presidency. And we pulled together a number of people who we think you would like to hear from on this subject, people who spend a lot of time discussing whatever it is that is going on in Washington, D.C. right now. But I read the papers, as you all do, and watch occasionally on television that there is a scandal at the White House. And it's interesting, this scandal has been reported as though it's World War III. And it has raised a lot of questions about press coverage. It's raised a lot of questions about the strength and nature of the presidency in this modern time. And so one way of trying to look at this and analyze it is perhaps to first get some of the numbers, some of the polling numbers done by the Pew Research Center on the People in the Press. Let me first, from sort of left to right, which is just geography, not politics, but Rahm Emanuel is to my far left here, and he is very kind to come rushing up here to fill in for Paul Begala, who got the flu today and could not come, and Rahm kindly is filling in, so thank you very much for coming up here. Rahm served in the Clinton campaign in 1992 and again in 96. He's been at the White House as long as the president has been here, and he's now a senior advisor to President Clinton. Bill Kovach is the curator of the Neiman Foundation and chairman in the last year of the Committee for Concerned Journalists, which is a group of about 800 journalists who are a bit concerned about the directions of journalism these days and are trying to hold a series of forums all over the country to discuss standards of journalism. To my immediate left, Gloria Borg, who writes the On Politics column for U.S. News and World Report. She appears regularly on Face the Nation and Washington Week in Review. To my right, John Ellis, who is a contributing columnist to the Boston Globe. He also writes a column for FoxNews.com on telecommunications and media issues. He's a consultant at Rasky Berlin Group, a communications and advertising consulting firm here in the Boston area. And to my far right, Andy Kohut, who is the director of the Pew Research Center for the People in the Press, which used to be the Los Angeles Times Research Center, doing essentially the same thing. And Andy has spent a lot of time trying to understand popular reaction, not only to politics in general, but to the press and how it functions. And I'd like to start our discussion of this rather inflamed issue by turning to Andy and ask him, what do the numbers tell us right now about both the president and the press?
You have given me 5 minutes. I prepared a 15-minute talk, so I'm going to
5
give
minutes, Andy.
every third word. There are two essential questions here. Why is the public reacting this way to the scandal? Secondly, what do Americans see as the press's legitimate watchdog role? Both of these questions are raised by public reaction to the public opinion polls of recent weeks. We have not been conducting tracking surveys, but we did conduct 2 weeks ago a re-interview survey of 1,000 people that we had interviewed prior to a nationally representative sample who we had originally interviewed prior to this story breaking. And to my mind, I came away with a better opinion of public opinion. I think it's very dismissive to be, it's very easy to be dismissive of the public, given what you read in the headlines about public opinion polls. I think on balance, the public's reaction is understandable and reasonable. We re-interviewed these people, and one of the early questions was to our sample of people who said that they approved in late in the month, but previously it said they had disapproved of Bill Clinton, had no or had no opinion. And our question was, say we notice you have a better opinion of Bill Clinton 3 weeks later. Why is that? They said 3 things. One, they liked the speech. It underscored many of the policies and Clinton performance that they've come to like. Secondly, they liked his ability to carry on despite the controversy. And they mentioned the media coverage. They mentioned the media coverage in 2 ways. They said they didn't like it, and they said that in many ways. And they said that in many ways, the media coverage gave them an opportunity to consider much of what they liked about Bill Clinton's policies and much of what they liked about Bill Clinton's performance. They also said something to us, this small group of people who had become favorable to Clinton, which all Americans share. That is, they distinguish between President Clinton, the man, and President Clinton, the president, or Bill Clinton, the president. 39% said they liked both Bill Clinton personally and his policies. 30% said they liked his policies, but not him as a man. And 24% said they liked neither. Now, turning these numbers around, we find 55% saying they don't like the president as a man, but more importantly, 70% like his policies. And that's the basis by which the American public is judging Bill Clinton. As to the broader development of public opinion, not the question of why the approval ratings have gone up from 60 to 70% in our poll, I think it's basically the fact that this is a scandal that has failed to convince Americans. It's one that's basically fizzled. The public had very high expectations about this scandal initially. In an important CBS poll, in the week of the week the scandal broke, 40% said this was a matter of grave importance to the nation. Much higher than had said this about Whitewater, 20%, much more than had said this about the campaign finance scandal. People were taking this very seriously. By the time we did our polling 2 weeks ago, that number had slipped back to 25%. The reason it has slipped back is there's been no growth in the percentage of people who think that Bill Clinton is guilty of lying or encouraging others to lie. In fact, there's actually slippage. I won't go through the numbers because I don't have time, but there's a smaller percentage who see Clinton as guilty of lying, encouraging to lie. A broad percentage of people think that he probably had a majority percentage think he had some sexual relationship with Monica Lewinsky, but only 9% say definitely, 43% say probably. So basically, we're in the area of sexual allegations about Bill Clinton. What else is new? The moral murkiness comes in on the question of consequences. If he is guilty, most people in our polls say he should go. But among the people who we ask who think he's probably not guilty, they say even if he's guilty, he should probably not go. So these subjunctive questions, these hypothetical questions are very misleading because they don't react to the hypothetical situation. People are reacting to what they believe, what the credibility of the charges are now. And right now we're in a situation where the public is saying these charges are maybe true, but not. We're not sure, and the public is unwilling to see a president who they admire a great deal, even though they don't personally respect him to a great extent, leave office or lose office on the basis of allegations. I'm skipping through this, and let me go directly to the question of press. As to the press, I think the most important thing about the press coverage is it has created a vision in the public's mind as a president who's beleaguered. 9% of the public definitely thinks that Bill Clinton has lied, but 68% think that most reporters think that Clinton has lied. When we ask the public to rate the coverage, they give it 46% positive, 51% negative. On Iran-Contra, with exactly the same question 10 years ago, the ratings were 68% positive, 31% negative. And that 31% negative at that time, 10 years ago, created quite a stir. But now we have a majority of people saying they don't like the coverage of a president involved in a major scandal, and the public faults the coverage for its excessiveness, for punditry in particular, and for being unfair, and that is, reporters are accused of not being objective and of not checking their facts. Those are the major beefs. The public also has questions about the role of the press. They say the press, it is the job of the press to provide information to the American public to make up its mind about whether the president lied. It is not the job of the press, say 52% of the public, to provide information about whether or not the president had a sexual affair. On balance, the public increases, this is only added to the very increasingly negative numbers that the public provides on press accuracy, the ratings that the public has of the accuracy of the press. And I think the real tragedy is that the percentage of people who say that press criticisms of political leaders is worth it has fallen from 67% in 1985 when we first asked these questions to only 55% today. It's a narrow 39 to 55%. The political watchdog role of the press is worthwhile, and that's a real, in my view, that's a real sad thing and a bad thing. And I think that's 5 minutes.
Terrific. Thank you very much, Andy. All of those numbers divide into two categories, really. Politics and the press, the public opinion concerning politicians, particularly President Clinton and the press. And not by coincidence, this panel is kind of divided pretty much along that line, too. And I'd like to start with John Ellis and ask John for his reaction to the numbers in light of the fact that on Saturday, just a few days ago, in your weekend column in the Boston Globe, you wrote, and I quote, "The Times story," a reference to a New York Times story last week, "The Times story is the beginning of the last act of Bill Clinton's presidency. The end could come with astonishing speed." And according to Andy, the scandal has fizzled. So, John, what's up?
Well, I don't. I've known Andy's work when he was at the Gallup organization, and also when you were with the LA Times. And in fact, in my consulting work, we wanted to contract with you to help us with CNBC. So I don't. I mean, obviously, I have the highest respect for the numbers. I think that the differentiation between Clinton's performance and Clinton the person is true, and I think that Clinton the person is in some serious legal difficulty, and so that I don't, in the legal context, I don't think that public opinion really matters. If the president lied, and if he encouraged others to lie, and that can be proven, then it doesn't matter what public opinion is. He will be in very serious trouble, and so public opinion polls are I think useful, and they tell us a lot. But I think in this case, there's sort of what happened and what the special prosecutor can prove what happened, and then there's sort of reaction. If the special prosecutor can prove that that President Clinton lied and encouraged others to lie, then public opinion will shift dramatically, I think.
What is the basis of your judgment that the end is either near or could come with, quote, astonishing speed?
I think that it is possible that a number of people will decide that it is better to cooperate with the special prosecutor than protect the president. And if these allegations are true, there are a lot of people who have knowledge of various pieces of this scandal. And if those people talk, then there could be some serious problems. So my guess is, my understanding is that at least 3 people on the White House staff are cooperating with the independent counsel. So I would take that to be bad news.
These 3 being?
The Betty Curry, and there are 2 others. I don't know who they are.
Also, how do you know that there are 3?
I was told.
By?
A person in the special prosecutor's office.
Okay. Rahm Emanuel, that should be sort of a pitch across the plate for you. What's your sense of the number?
I'm just going to ask David Kendall to amend his brief today with a 13th point on leaks from the independent counsel office. I actually think on the way up here, I was trying to, since we were going to talk about press, politics, and the coverage of this issue, and now having lived, when President Clinton announced, I moved down to Little Rock about 3 weeks after that, and having gone through a number of what we call feeding frenzies and scandals, and the feeding frenzy that erupts around a scandal. And I think that the one thing that is finally different about this was the picture of Betty Curry. And I don't know that Andrew's polling and what changed dramatically. I don't want to pin this on Betty Curry, and I'm not pinning it on Betty Curry, but I think the American people saw the media and what a feeding frenzy can do to an individual who walks out of a courthouse and can't find her car because of the cameras and the people. And that picture of Betty Curry in that frenzy spoke to the American people what a media frenzy is like. And I don't think that's the conclusive evidence of how they feel about the media, but I think that fright captured on her face sent, I think, people back realizing that the media was jumping to conclusions, drawing, and pundits were making assertions without data. And I think if I'm not mistaken, from your own reporting on CNN when you were on there, you said you sourced in basic articles 90% of the claims were unsourced, which I think is I think by any profession, a high figure. So
Unnamed or poorly.
Unnamed or poorly. So I think, but that's one. I think where's the public on the press? I think the Betty Curry picture, I think, grabbed a sense of what is a media frenzy, the sense of fright that it's brought to people, and the sense that maybe the media was getting ahead of the story and before the actual facts had caught up. I also think it's not for me to defend the press, but I also think a lot of the press are in uncharted waters here. And therefore, they're writing the rules as they go. I do think that a lot of the media and analysis of the media are in the business of repeating and not reporting, and I think that's bad. I don't mean it from a moral, but I mean it from a professional standpoint. I think we've got a couple instances today, the Wall Street Journal finally retracting their story from Thursday, acknowledging that, in fact, what they reported on Thursday was not true. I talked to the Wall Street Journal today, complimented them for their honesty in coming forward and acknowledging that. The Dallas Morning News story on something else to that effect. But I also think if we could go beyond this issue that's present, although I expect all the presentations by the panel and the questions to kind of focus on this, you also have a situation, basically, if you look for over the years, you can't treat every issue that's arisen as a gate or a scandal. You cannot expect the American voters over 20 years to have the volume button always turned on 10 and expect to hear the shrill from the press. You know, one of the things I just recently noted, I remember the Arlington Cemetery scandal. 2 weeks later, a GAO report on page A14, reported in the Washington Post, said that there, in fact, was no connection between contributions or anybody else, but it was a reminder buried. It was not of the size of the accusation. It didn't lead the paper. It didn't get reported on the news. It was ended up in A14. And I think one of the things the press has to do is put something in perspective. Politicians have their own lesson to draw from the press, and I'm sure we'll get our lessons. But on the other hand, on this stuff, whether you're dealing with Iran-Contra or the travel office, when you keep it at the same volume, you overstay your welcome on the welcome mat with the American people. And I think that things have to be measured. I think that, you know, if I'm not here in the job of giving a lesson to the press, but I will say that on this issue, it's more important to get it right before you get it right away. And I think that in a lot of these situations that we've witnessed over the last, it's hard to believe it's only been 2 weeks, it feels like a little longer, but I got two other points to make. It feels, actually a little longer than 2 weeks, but in the last 2 weeks that this story has shifted and you've seen all the different permutations of it come out. I think people need to slow down, get it right before they get it right away. The other thing that I think, one of the reasons I think the Betty Curry picture, and I would add a second point, one of the things I also think that's undercutting the credibility of the media at this point, more than the picture. This story broke with Matt Drudge from Internet, who deals with, I would say, the low end of gossip, if not other material. And everybody, not everybody, but I think the public is aware where this story began. What I find interesting is that a colleague of the press by the name of Joe Conason in the New York Observer wrote a story. It's not an Internet kind of rumor mill Internet story, but Joe Conason works for the New York Observer, broke a story the other day and yet not a major news organization has followed it up. So all the major news organizations decided to follow up internet source website that deals with rumor and innuendo, and they've decided not to follow up a colleague's story on whether, in fact, a witness in the Whitewater story was tampered with, whether that's true or not true. It just happens to exist out there hanging with not a single affirmation or confirmation or denial.
With all of your criticism of the press, and a lot of it, I think, anyway, quite justified, there is a way that the White House, and the President particularly, could put a lot of this behind him by telling the American people what happened.
Well,
in other words, there would be no need then for the speculation and the gossip and everything else.
well, I'm not sure that's the only answer to that.
No, but-
I agree with that. Let me say two things. You work in a situation, I think the President's desire to say more rather than less and do it sooner rather than later is, not only do I believe it, it is genuine, he would like to. You work in two contexts, one political, one legal. In a situation like this, the gravitational pull on the legal side is more dominant than the one on the political. Even though it's a political context, we also operate in it. We happen to also be operating in a legal context. And I think, to quote Boyd and Gray, George Bush's legal counsel, as he said yesterday, he'd give the same recommendation to his, if President Clinton was his counsel, which would never be, but if it was his counsel, he said that he would advise him to be silent at this point. And that's where you are. Now, as somebody who has to get out there and try to deal with the situation in the public domain, you basically can't answer certain questions because you have an independent prosecutor, which I have more time than I think people want to hear about my views on that, but an independent counsel is walking around with a loaded subpoena gun and has shown willingness to use it with indiscretion.
Okay, thank you very much, Ron. Gloria Borg, you're one of them. I mean, you're right there in the middle of it all. You're in Washington. You're one of the leading political reporters in the nation's capital. The numbers that Andy was talking about say they don't like the punditry. They don't think that the press is being objective. They don't think it's being fair. They think the press already thinks and bases its reports on the belief that the president is guilty. Stand up and fight for your group.
Should I just shoot myself? Right? My name is Gloria Borg, and I am a journalist. Okay, this is
your AA meeting.
this is my AA meeting, right?
Thank you very much.
I've listened to what everybody here has said, and I agree with little pieces of it. I mean, clearly what Andy is saying is accurate. The voters like Bill Clinton a lot more than they like us in a lot of ways, and that's just fine. This story is not about us. It's not about the media. There are problems with the way the media has covered this story, but this is a story about whether the President of the United States has suborned perjury, has perjured himself, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You know all the issues here. This is a story that is a completely mediated story, I believe, which is very difficult for reporters to do, and we are not perfect about it. Ram makes some very good points because we are making up the rules as we go along. By a mediated story, I mean I can't go to Ram, stick a microphone in his face and say, okay, Ram, tell me what the real story is. Tell me what the president told you about this yesterday. Explain to me what his real relationship with Monica Lewinsky is, because the president and his advisors are saying, in fact, they cannot do that for reasons which I must say I disagree with, but they are saying that. And therefore, we have to go to sources. We get leaked to, we get spun. None of this is new in journalism. This is the way it works. And we are in a very difficult situation here because we are the ones giving you all the news. We cannot tell you so-and-so said to me yesterday because you're protecting a source. We have to make judgments about our sources. What's the motive of this source? What's the motive of that source? Whom do you believe? Matt Drudge is somebody that Ram mentioned. I don't believe Matt Drudge and I are in the same business, to tell you the truth. I believe we do very, very different things. So it's a very difficult story for us to cover. And I believe that, as Ram would say, we all ought to take a deep breath and sit back and cover the story the way good journalists are supposed to do it, which is piece by piece. We have to piece this story together. Nobody is holding a press conference for us to tell us what really happened here. The lawyers are holding press conferences. By the way, I think the lawyers are making the journalists look good in all of this, I must say, but the lawyers are the
That's
ones.
a very low bar.
Yeah, I know. And so what we are trying to do, in the absence of any explanation from the president for whatever reason, is try and do what journalists always do, which is try and find out exactly what happened. I do believe, I just want to talk about a point that John Ellis made, which is that I do believe public opinion does matter in this, and I believe it matters dramatically because in the end, this is going to be a political story. In the end, the independent counsel, Ken Starr, may decide that he's got to throw this over to the Congress if he feels that there are some offenses here that need to be dealt with. And when the Congress deals with something, it is always political, and public opinion does matter in this. So I believe that the White House cares very deeply about the 79% approval rating the president has today, and I believe that the public has to be paid attention to in all of this. As a journalist, however, I don't do daily tracking polls. The only thing that worries me is that my readers won't believe what I'm writing. And in the end, that's a problem that I believe that we journalists really have to deal with. And I think as we get on in this panel, I have some ideas about how we may be able to deal with all of that, but I'd like to reserve that for a little bit.
Why can't more journalists simply say, I don't know, and not write and not broadcast if they don't know?
Don't know what?
Don't know a fact.
Well, if you don't know a fact, you shouldn't write it. I mean, I was flying up here tonight. I was reading Newsweek's cover story, Newsweek, which has produced the Rosetta Stone of this entire story. And Newsweek was talking about a New York Times story last week about Betty Curry. The New York Times broke that story. And Newsweek said, the New York Times reported, comma, and Newsweek magazine has confirmed, comma, blah, 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 which is exactly how it should be. We shouldn't be saying reportedly, apparently, this one, now. You know, we shouldn't be relying on other people's journalism. We should be writing what it is we know directly. The problem is, to tell you the truth, is that there are about 15 or 20 sources, you know, in this entire story. It's a very, very small universe. It may be getting larger now. But in the press of competition, et cetera, I think, you know, journalists are using other people's reporting as their own. I don't do that. My magazine doesn't do that. CBS doesn't do that. I mean, you have to independently confirm what other people are reporting. And I also might add that somebody in a grand jury room, or one lawyer is going to tell you, interpret facts one way, and another lawyer is going to interpret the same set of facts another way. If any of you were going home after this event, you're going to write a lead about what occurs, okay? I guarantee you we would have 50 different leads from this audience about what the most important thing was that was said here tonight. So just think about that. Go home. If you're going home with your spouse, say, okay, what's the lead you would write out of this event tonight? And what's the lead you would write? And I bet you two would have different interpretations. So this is what we're up against every day.
Depends on how long you've been married. Listen, Bill Kovich, you, we were saying earlier, Bill, that when you're in journalism, as a journalist, you have one view of what it is that journalists are supposed to be doing and in fact are doing, and that when you're out of journalism, as we both are now, you have a somewhat different view, and it ends up being a bit more critical. So listen to Andy's numbers. What's your judgment of what the numbers say and what your colleagues have said?
Two things. I think Andy's numbers, Gloria, I think Andy's numbers say the press is part of the story. I think the press is part of the story, whether it wants to be or not. The press may choose not to write about that part of the story, but I think those numbers say the press is part of the story, because if the public's trustworthiness in the watchdog role of the American press is declining in the numbers that poll suggests, that's very dangerous for all of us. And I think it's the reason the Committee for Concerned Journalists organized itself even before the Lady Di accident, because of the concern about the standing of the press in the eyes of the American public because of the combination of forces, the new economic organization of the press in this world of cyberspace journalism. Matt Drudge is not out there alone. The reason the Dallas Morning News and the Wall Street Journal were led into the mistakes they made was that they were competing with Matt Drudge in cyberspace. They chose to put up on the web stories that neither of the newspapers had completely checked out to the satisfaction that they would have required to put it in the newspaper. But because they had a presence on the web and had a need to compete in that world for some reason, why that compulsion to compete in nanoseconds is there has not been explained, at least to my satisfaction. But that is part of the story that's out there now that the American people are asking questions about. And it represents itself, at least it did in the first 4 or 5 days of the coverage of this story, in a complete abandonment of most standards of traditional journalism in terms of sourcing stories. The degree to which journalists hid behind the word "if," as though that protected whatever came after, was stunning. I think Marvin and I were talking about this earlier, and we both agreed that the sense of, well, I'll speak for myself, I agreed, and I think Marvin listened, but the sense of the coverage the first 3 or 4 days was clearly, we know this guy did it in terms of his behavior with this woman, and he may even have suborned perjury, but the stories didn't tell me that. They implied that, and the tone of the stories were written with that veneer all over them. And yet none of the backup came, none of the facts came, none of the sourcing that said to me, someone who had direct access to real evidence had made this case. And those standards should be the standards that watchdog journalism, whether it's investigative journalism or, as we're into now, reporting on someone else's investigation, which is a different thing. The standard has to be, if you're dealing with a public who you're offering to provide a view of a world they cannot see themselves, you have to give them the facts in the story to justify their trust in what you say happened.
Bill, and just picking up the thrust of what it is that you're saying, and then a phrase that Ram used when he said that the press is now in uncharted waters. I don't want to say that the captain of the ship in these uncharted waters is Matt Drudge, but the internet is increasingly playing a very, very significant role here. I was mentioning to Andy before that there's something like 60-some-odd million Americans over the age of 16 who are online, and over the next 6 months they expect another 7 million to come online. So that gives someone like a Matt Drudge a much larger audience potentially to deal with. And if he is dealing with information that is not solid, that puts the American people at risk. John, what is your thought?
I just want to say one thing about Matt Drudge, which is that the way that this story first developed was that Michael Isikoff got in a huge argument with his editors at Newsweek about whether or not his story should run, and the decision was made that it needed further checking. And somebody left that meeting in New York at Newsweek and called Matt Drudge and said, "They just spiked my story." It's not true?
That is not true.
No.
That's what I was told by an editor at Newsweek. But anyway, the point is that Matt's report that appeared on Sunday morning and was quoted on the papers did not say that this scandal was coming. It said that Newsweek had spiked the story, which was accurate. And then
Spiked or
It had not
delayed?
spiked.
John?
spiked it, wasn't it?
Delayed it.
Delayed whatever the language was. But the point is that
He
what
said
Matt reported that on the whatever it is, the Drudge report or whatever, was that Newsweek had delayed the story, which was true.
Gloria, that's not true, you're saying.
Well, Michael Isikoff did not get in a screaming match. There were some very reasoned discussions at Newsweek, and the crazy media, believe it or not, decided the editors at Newsweek were quite concerned that they were going to be writing something about a girl they had not yet interviewed, a 24-year-old girl, that they would be leveling very substantial charges against the President of the United States, that there were some major issues here that needed to be done. There was the question of the independent counsel, et cetera, et cetera. So this was not a screaming match, an emotional thing. These were, I'm told, very serious discussions about quite a weighty story and what you do with it. And Newsweek, in fact, decided, I think, rightly so at that point, to hold off publication. However, they did, in the middle of the week, put their own version on the web.
And what did
Wednesday.
But Gloria, did they find out something that unleashed them between Sunday, when they decided they didn't know enough,
You have
and
to ask them
Wednesday?
that. Yeah, I think they did, and I think.
The Washington
Or was it
Post.
simply that the Washington Post
Well-
went forward with the story?
Washington.
The story.
Well, no, go ahead.
Go ahead, Ron. And then Andy.
I want to say, this is my remembrance of the
Newsweek
events.
should
It's only
speak
2
for
weeks ago.
itself,
Yeah, they should speak for themselves. It wasn't that the papers had picked it up. You had a story, Newsweek decided to hold it for whatever reason. Drudge picked it up, whether it came out of Newsweek or Goldberg, which is not yet clear, was then referred, Bill Kristol mentioned it on the show, which then kicked it. Everybody halted for a little while. The Post took it from basically the sexual component to the suborning perjury component, and they ran it that Tuesday. That's
And that's
that's
when
my,
Newsweek
if I,
figured it out.
not to say that one pays that much attention in the White House, obviously, to the story, but my remembrance of events is in that nature, and that's how that story unfolds.
The reason I raised this question with Gloria is that I can imagine Newsweek holding up the story and then simply being overwhelmed by the rush of the LA Times, the Washington Post, everybody else going with it, so they put it out on the internet. They put it out on their page. So at least they're part of the action. They've got a piece of the story. Andy, could you help us not only with this stuff, but also what do your numbers tell us about the internet and their role in politics? and its role?
Very small percentage of people, 4%, said in the first week of this scandal that they went on to the internet. But the impact of the internet is not on the public, it's on the journalists. But what I want to talk about is follow up on what Bill said about implication versus fact. And there's a lot of public bashing that goes on. The public is morally indifferent. The public doesn't pay attention. It's easily confused. Would you pass me a copy of the report? I didn't bring my report.
With pleasure.
Thank you, sir. We asked the public. The public does a very good job of sorting out implication from fact. We read a list of things to the public in our sample, and we said, now tell us, is this something that is fact or something that's accusation? Clinton knew Lewinsky. 78% that said that's a fact. Only 19% said it's an accusation. There are tape recordings of Lewinsky talking to Tripp. 49% fact. Clinton gave Lewinsky gifts. 39% fact, 59% accusation. Clinton left messages on Lewinsky's answering machine. 23% fact, 70% accusation. A lot of public opinion has to do with the fact that the American public hasn't come to some conclusive judgment about this. And to your point, if you take these polls apart and you look at the people who have come to judgment, in either direction, particularly in the direction that the president is definitely guilty, Democrats and independents say he must go. But the vast majority of the American public is either, well, maybe, or probably not.
But they should be that way. It's perfectly reasonable and rational, because I'm that way, and I'm reporting the story. We don't know the answers.
But Gloria, it does not come across that way. By the second day of this scandal in Washington, Washington had made up its mind. And it comes screaming through in the television.
It's impossible to read and listen and not come to that.
The real story,
Go ahead.
I mean, not the real story, or one of the offshoots of the real story. My lawyer won't let me talk about the real story. No,
You have a lawyer?
no, I don't. 5.5 years without one. I have a son, not a lawyer. I think it's a disconnect between the American people and the press. And I think one of the things, I'm all for talking everything we want to talk about the press, how they covered it, the mistakes they've made. We can go into how the White House has handled it. We can all do that. One of the things I'm shocked about in my 6 years on the national political scene, but especially in Washington, is the dismissive way that Washington ends up treating the public. And it comes and bleeds through constantly, both on the dismissiveness of the values they have towards the values they try to raise their families, the sense in which they try to make ends meet. The American people, it is just this culture of dismissiveness towards, I don't want to say middle America, I happen to be from Chicago, so I have it from that, but there's a dismissiveness that emanates out of Washington.
By who?
Well, I think by my own research and having looked and been a student somewhat of public opinion, I think when the American people, one of the things that over the years you look at, they always say, the American people don't like Washington. They happen to throw the press in there. They don't distinguish just two ends of Pennsylvania Avenue. They happen to see the establishment and the press part of Washington in that whole kind of microcosm that exists within the Beltway. But I find there's a flavor and a tone, and you can see it in the sense of how, the outrage of the American people for not being outraged. There is a dismissiveness of the qualities and their values that they bring there that literally bleeds through the stories and bleeds through the covering. And I have seen it on the public policy side, and I've seen it on the press side. And I think
Give me an illustration of this dismissive.
dismissive. I'll take it from a totally separate issue.
Go ahead.
Nafta. I ran the effort for the president to pass Nafta. And happened to think it was, good for the economy. It's a central part, trade and open trade is an essential part of his economic strategy. I think there's a legitimate argument to that. And trade, open trade, given what middle America and a lot of industrial America went through the 80s, you can understand for a very simple reason why people had a real fear about trade and fair trade in this country. Yet when the writing of NAFTA, I've used this to get my point across. And I've simply had reporters in Washington, because they thought, yes, they were part of the established, free trade is a good policy. Those who opposed it were playing on nativistic fears and were playing on people's fears, and it came through in the stories. And you know what? The American people, from very good experience, have an understanding that affects their lives, why they were scared and frightened of free trade. And you can see that dismissive attitude about them not understanding the economic world we lived in. And it came through, and having run NAFTA, and I can go chapter and verse over it, and I happen to think it's good for economics, and it happens to be the right thing to do. We have to do a better understanding if this is part of the post-Cold War economic relations are going to be the type of relations we engage in at an international level. But you've got to understand the fear that American people have, and the values coming out of Washington was dismissive towards the American people.
The values coming out of Washington, quote unquote,
The
you're talking about the
establishment.
press.
Right, and I'm including this.
Only the press?
No,
or-
I'm not. I'm saying this. There is
Who's
a
this establishment? I mean, you
Well,
live
yeah,
there.
listen,
right?
during the fast track debate, I kept wondering if the Trilateral Commission
No,
had a
who is-
website. I'd like to help where it was.
Who
for
is
all-
this establishment?
Well, I think there's a culture that establishes in
No,
Washington.
no, but who is it?
I call it the Gang of 200. But I mean, it's part of the press, it's part of the social scene that exists in Washington, it's part of the elected officials that part of it, and it's part of the
So
establishment.
the press was taking a position on NAFTA one way or the other? and-
The press took a position on trade. I'll go through that. I
No,
can also
don't,
do
don't.
that.
It's another subject.
Okay.
We'll have you back for that, too.
Right.
Gloria, you said
Give me a little more
before-
heads up next time.
You said that you have some ideas about how press coverage could be improved?
Look, I think in this particular story, first let me say that there is a breathless quality crisis in the White House. It's on the television every night, et cetera, et cetera. However, I don't want to underplay the significance of this story either. This is an important story. I think the American people believe this is an important story, and contrary to what Ram is saying, I don't talk down to my readers or my viewers. And I believe that we hopefully share an interest in what's important to this country.
Can I just ask
Yeah,
one question?
sure.
You agree that there's a conventional wisdom that can set in a press corps? Yes or no?
Yeah, although,
You're beginning to sound like a lawyer.
I would never bill at that level, though.
you know what?
No,
There-
do-
here's the thing, the press corps.
Okay, then-
What is the press
I got three
corps.
sets of questions. I'll ask them in order. Do you believe there's a conventional wisdom that sits in the press corps? You don't have to answer.
Sometimes.
Do you believe that your social and economic values sometimes bleed through in your stories?
Well, I'm a columnist, so
Okay,
it's
do you,
different.
for your colleagues who are day-to-day journalists?
Sure.
That's all I wanted to say.
You rest your case? No, let me finish. I forgot my point I was making here. No, all I'm saying is that we are involved every day in this kind of a give and take where the White House is, excuse me for using the word spin, trying to change the subject, trying to turn it around, trying to tell us what their point of view is, which is completely legitimate. We have competing points of view we deal with Republicans, we deal with Democrats, right? And so I think that, this is something the American public is now sorting through in this story because it is out there. It is ugly. It's not easy to cover this story, and there are the stakes could not be higher. And that is why you're seeing what you're seeing, quite frankly.
John Ellis, you've been, you're a columnist now, and I know you from the old days at NBC. What is driving the news right now?
I mean, from my point of view, I think what's driving the news is this is a good story and therefore gets high ratings, and high ratings lead to more advertising dollars. This is particularly true in the cable universe. When I was a consultant to CNBC, we had a sort of a bifurcated programming schedule. We had all business and financial news from basically 5:30 in the morning till 7 at night, and then we had this talk show stuff in the evening in prime time. O.J. Simpson allegedly murders his wife, and we looked at that story and we said, okay, if we do all of our talk shows about O.J. Simpson, we'll get much better ratings than we're getting with what we're doing now. We programmed the evening talk shows to O.J. Simpson, and our ratings went through the roof. When we came in, we were losing $29 million at CNBC. When we left at the end of the O.J. trial, we had turned a profit of $79 million. So there's
In what period of time?
2.5 years. So there's a real economic incentive at the cable level to do as much with this story as you possibly can, because it brings a lot of people to your cable channel in a highly competitive television market. For the networks, the network newscasts have seen basically no bump from this story. And the person who has benefited the most from it is Ted Koppel. And in situations like this, Koppel does particularly well because there's a great focus on Washington, and it's sort of, for most people who don't have, either aren't home to watch the evening news or aren't like, people in the Washington Press Corps who pay attention to it, the only place to get sort of a serious discussion and a serious report on it on television is Ted Koppel. So he's the main network beneficiary. But these cable channels, MSNBC, Fox News Channel, CNN, this is their kind of story. And the reason it's their kind of story is because they think they can double their numbers and therefore double their advertising.
John, the networks have seen a bump in their Sunday shows and in their...
Yeah, I was talking about the evening newscast, which
right.
has seen virtually no bump. I think ABC newscast, the World News Tonight, has seen a little bit of a bump.
I have a question for Kovich, and I'd like to say this is the time when, if you want to ask questions, there are a couple of microphones right here, and please come on up to them, and I will recognize you. But Bill, I want to ask you, you are leading or a co-leader of this movement now to try to get the journalists to think seriously about many of the problems that we've been discussing in questions as well. Are they listening?
Are the journalists listening?
Yeah.
Yeah, the journalists are listening, and they're engaged in the conversation. We've had 3 forums, Chicago, New York, Michigan. We have 14, 15 more going, and we've already engaged maybe 200 journalists, a lot of journalism students, a lot of members of the active, engaged public in those communities. What we're struggling with is the changing world of competition that is pressuring all the rules that we have lived by in my career, and now I know Gloria and the journalists I respect try to live by, but these pressures, the competitive pressure that's driven by the new technology and the new economic organization of news media, those two forces are changing what's expected out of the newsroom.
Bill, the reporters are great at self-flagellation. They like nothing more than to talk about themselves.
No.
Yes, they
No.
do. They're constantly involved in it, constantly talking about themselves.
And complaining about
But
what
will
they
they,
do.
or
Complaining about what they do.
Will they change anything about the way in which they cover a story? No, I mean, draw the distinction if you can.
Oh, I think they already have in this story. I think the coverage today is quantitatively different than it was
The first week.
the first week. I think you read any story today and lay it beside a similar story a week ago, and you'll see the difference in care, in sourcing, and in an effort to characterize the source when possible, to give me as a reader a sense of where this is coming from.
That's because the White House has been very smart. Because the White House is, the first week was about Clinton, the second week was about Ken Starr, and the third week was about the press. So
And
we're
the fourth-
having this panel about the media.
I want to get to the questions, but I want to
Wait a minute, we're having this panel about the media instead of about the other issue.
No, I'm not taking a lead from the White House.
Can I
The other issue being defined as what?
The other issue being defined as the problems Bill Clinton now faces in his presidency.
Well, why don't you
Just
report?
when I thought there was hope for you,
Well,
Gloria. There it goes.
I mean, who's stopping you from reporting? Okay, look, on the questions, we're going to have a lot of them. The time is limited. Identify yourself, and please ask the question. And if you wish to direct it at anybody, do. Go ahead. You go first.
My name is Seth Stern. I'm a graduate student here at the Kennedy School. Someone had mentioned that the public is attacking the pundits. They don't like pundits.
Andy Kohut.
Yet I had read somewhere that the pundit shows are the ones with the greatest ratings. I'm wondering, to what degree is the media frenzy fed by the public demand, and is there a difference between what the public is saying and what they're watching or interested in?
Andy, please.
Let me try to answer that. There is a difference between broad public interest and intense interest among the audience that is attracted to tabloid shows. O.J. Simpson was a story that both attracted a large audience in audience measurement terms, but did not attract a majority of the American public, because the people who were hooked on O.J. were so connected to that story that they watched it religiously and they watched it fervently. You only need 25% of the American public to have a hit television show. And basically, you can have a situation where there are big audiences on the one hand, yet the vast majority of the public says, I'm not really all that interested in it. And the vast majority of the public can't escape stories like that because they're all over.
Terrific. Thank you very much for the question and the answer. Yes, please.
Hi, I'm Jacqueline Newmeyer. I'm a first year at the college from Washington, D.C. My question is for Mr. Emanuel. I read in this morning's New York Times that Bruce Lindsay, the deputy White House counsel and one of the president's closest advisors, he has long advocated a policy of releasing as little information as possible. And on the other hand, we have a public that clearly, is seeking the truth. And you're saying that the political considerations that would dictate telling the truth are being outweighed by legal considerations. Does the fact that the legal considerations are outweighing the political considerations suggest that Mr. Ellis is right, that the president, the man, not the president, the politician, is in such legal hot water that, that could sink the presidency?
Well, first of all, let's assume that what we said isn't the truth. That's what the question assumed. There's two charges out there. One is about sexual relations, the other one is about perjury. In both, the president's been emphatic. And until basically the independent prosecutor wraps up what he's doing, it would be ill-advised by the president's counsel to answer other questions which he wants to answer. That's one. The article about Bruce Lindsay, that's Bruce's position, whether you're in a legal situation or not a legal situation. Bruce's view is always more skeptical, and that's his perspective on things. One of the things that I find ironic is we're being accused of not saying anything, and yet this whole story is about leaks. We're being accused of always putting stuff out. So you can't be criticized on both sides on that ledger. I think that Bruce's advice is based on, he's always had that position, but in particular in this one, he's being shared by the lawyers, and that's where we are in the situation.
Thank you.
Yes, please.
My name is Jared Genzer. I'm a second-year graduate student in public policy here. You can excuse me a little bit because I might be a little bit wet behind the ears, to say the least. But I wanted to ask a question about moral and ethical considerations and bring that up with regards to the journalistic coverage of this particular situation. I recognize clearly there is a story here. I mean, I'm not that wet behind the ears to not recognize the basics of that. But I wanted to ask Mr. Ellis a question specifically because you had stated that you spoke to someone in the independent prosecutor's office who gave you a piece of information that you used in one of your stories. And I was curious if there's any ethical concern on your part that although there is the public demand for information, and clearly economically it's in everyone's best interest to get every bit of information out on the table, do you have any questions about the integrity of your, the person who you are speaking with when they are breaking the law in order to tell you that particular bit of information? And do you have any questions about your own integrity with regards to reporting that information?
No. No, I mean, I don't think he was breaking the law. I think he was telling me that that there were two others who were cooperating with a special and when I asked him who they were, he wouldn't tell me. So I don't see that as a great ethical breach on his part.
Okay, well, let me then follow that up. I guess I'd misunderstood what you had said. Clearly, there are lots of reports in the media where there are leaks coming from the independent prosecutor's office or references to people in the independent prosecutor's office who are talking about specifically about grand jury testimony of witnesses, et cetera, which in my understanding is in fact illegal. Would you suggest that there's a problem if that is in fact the case?
If there's a there's a problem in yeah, I mean, there's a problem if you're breaking the law. You bet there's a problem.
Can I comment on just a second?
But you
Because I think this makes a point.
Are you finished?
Go ahead, John.
Well, I just, yes, there's a problem if you're breaking the law. The funny thing about the law in Washington is that, you know, I mean, Marvin Kalb, I mean, had a very good source at the Department of State for many, many years, and he was given material that could have been a violation of national security, and therefore, I mean, is that not fair to say?
No, it's definitely wrong.
I mean, leaking is
I did write the
endemic in
Kissinger
Washington.
book, but it,
No, I understand it's endemic, but
So I don't know that. I mean, it's where you draw those lines can be tricky, but.
Bill Kovich, go ahead.
I don't want him to feel too wet behind the ears. I think part of the problem is that you're dealing with is that you're reading stories that give you information that looks as though it's coming out of the special prosecutor's office, but it's written in such a way it could have come from anywhere. I mean, I think the sourcing has been so sloppy or so nebulous, or I'm not sure crafty the first 3 or 4 days. They were moving too fast. Maybe now. But the first 2 or 3 days, I think it was just because there weren't a lot of sources out there. To be honest,
Well,
I saw too many stories.
Okay, Ron goes first.
Ron goes first, and then Gloria. Go ahead.
I want you to be careful before you make a judgment when you read the story that John or anyone else is using information that came out of the grand jury.
I'd make 2 comments, one on what John said, one on the question. One is, I don't think a reporter has an ethical problem if somebody out of the independent counsel's office gave him material and he or she sourced that. That's not an ethical problem for a reporter if they're sourcing the material, etc. The ethical and legal problem exists on the independent counsel side, not on the journalist side. That's one. 2, when John said to the fact that, well, all the Washington leaks, look, I participated in creating a story and crafting a story and getting material out selectively as well as widespread, but none of them deal in the legal context of a grand jury investigation. They deal with whether you're dealing with your child care proposal is going to be $21 billion, $19 billion, 18 in tax areas or in block grants. That is totally indifferent. The solemn oath of those in the grand jury, and the reason there's secrecy about there, it is the fundamental core of a grand jury process, is to protect all those subjects, whether they be witnesses or the targets. And the reason you have a 6E is because that is the fundamental core of what a grand jury investigation is to protect every individual involved. And the violation does not exist on the reporter side. And the reason you could never move Dave Kendall on this, but why you finally did, was the overwhelming data that was available for the violation of what is the principal core sworn oaths that you have to take when you basically organize a grand jury for this type of investigation. And you cannot publicly try people like that. It is to protect their person and their character and their
Gloria, did you
reputation.
wanna-
Yeah, I
Thank
just
you.
want to add a couple things. One is that you always.
Thank you.
You have a
Buy you
relative
dinner.
here.
Right. Yeah, Paul somehow got here.
In terms of journalists and sources, you always have to question and know what the motive of your, if my source is Rahm on a story, and I'm promising him anonymity, I know that Rahm is going to be out there because he wants to tell me something that's going to be good for the White House, and we understand that. The interesting thing about this story is not only if the leaks are coming from the independent counsel's office, but there's a larger circle. Say you have the independent counsel office sort of right in the middle. They're right there. Then you have around it, you have people going before a grand jury, okay? They come out, they talk to their attorneys. Their attorneys talk to the White House lawyers. The circle gets bigger, okay? So there are more people who have this information. Then it gets passed on to another lawyer who's helping that lawyer. Then the circle, it gets a little bigger. So the question I have as a journalist is, what's the best way for me as a reporter to make you think that my story is accurate and to give you a hint? I can't tell you who my sources are. That's important, because if we didn't have anonymous sources, we'd only have official government releases on what the government would want the people to think. So we don't want to go there, right? We all agree with that. So in this kind of a story, what would be the best way for us as reporters to give you a hint about the motives of our sources? And I was thinking today, we were talking about this at dinner. What if we said, so-and-so, so-and-so, so-and-so. You were too busy. So-and-so, so-and-so, blah, 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 has, U.S. News has learned, according to sources close to the Clinton
Legal team.
White House, Clinton team, if
Legal
you
team.
want, legal team.
Legal team.
Or so-and-so, so according to sources close to the Ken Starr investigation. In other words, give the readers or give the viewers, maybe this is a way to do it, some sense of the motives of your sources. Because that's what the voters are telling us, correct me if I'm wrong, which is that they don't have any sense of how to make any judgment on this, and I don't blame them, because they really don't know. And it's not like we elitist journalists are trying to keep a secret from the American public. It's just that you have certain ground rules that somehow, in this particular story, demand a little bit of revising, I think. We ought to think about that.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, please.
Hello, my name is David Orr. I'm a freshman at the college and a liberal Democrat from the Upper West Side of Manhattan.
One source close to, right?
There was talk a few minutes back about what's driving the story. And I think that something different than ratings is driving the story. I think it's silence. I think it's the total cowardice on the part of the president in not facing these charges. Regardless of the law, I want to hear from my president. We voted him in, and now he's the president, and he should tell us. Here's my question.
You can ask me a question.
Does anyone think that this story can or should disappear until the president tells us the entire truth?
No.
That's an easy one, no. Would you even disagree with that, Ruth?
No, I think it eventually, the president said he wants to do that. I don't have a disagreement with that.
Okay.
And now, can I also say this? Gloria said, our strategy is to attack the press. In fact, just the opposite. The press seems to be doing a great job of that of themselves. And the fact is that, no, because there is a process actually in every one of these frenzies, if you just kind of study them. There is this basic point in which there's this self-reflection moment. We happen to be in that moment at this time. I think this will also pass. I'm not sure a lot of corrective actions will be taken through that process. I think that what you have here, though, is a situation where the president at the right time will want to do that. He's already expressed that, and he just can't given the legal context. And I think that's just where we are at this point.
Why can't he? I don't understand that.
Because you have a situation, Gloria. Gloria, first of all, you know very well. I mean, I'm not going to quote Chuck Ruff. I'm not going to quote David Kendall. I'm not going to quote Bob Bennett. I'll quote Seaborn Gray. You just live in a context with an independent counsel roaming around here, and until that situation clears itself up, He is not going to answer any more questions than
I would
needs
just
to
make the
answer.
case that the President of the United States is not an ordinary client, that his responsibility is to the American people.
And I'll say this, Gloria, that is correct, and he feels an obligation to the American people. Also, this is a president who is facing a situation with an independent counsel who has shown time and again, through his activities outside of the independent counsel's office, a partisanship and a desire. And I think given the way he's done his other investigations, and it took him 3 years to conclude on a suicide, he has yet to conclude the FBI case, he has yet to conclude the travel office, it's dealt with the Whitewater issue 4.5 years, $40 million, and he has yet to conclude that when Flight 800, $18 million was spent in 1 year. They issued a report. I sometimes wonder what the cloud is over the independent counsel office. And I'll tell you this, General Eisenhower finished with the Allied forces, finished World War II in a quicker time than Ken Starr has finished the Whitewater investigation. And every day that goes by, I'm more and more impressed with General Eisenhower.
You've heard it.
I tell you this, and General Eisenhower finished it without subpoena power.
Please, your question.
My name's Mary Walsh. I'm just a citizen of Massachusetts. I want to address this to Mr. Ellis and Ms. Borg. It's not up to dismissing the public. 2 issues. All last weekend we heard what was wrong with the morals of the American public. And I don't think that the press has at all addressed the fear and the consternation of the American public at some very basic constitutional rights that we're seeing abused with regard to the grand jury and to depositions. And I think that's a big story with the American public. And the other thing is, the press has been so concerned about whether the president lied, whether he committed perjury. And yet I, as a former smoker who had lung cancer, watched 8 tobacco executives under oath commit perjury, and I never saw the press clamoring for them to be brought up and tried for perjury. So I think Ron is right. You do dismiss the concerns of the American people.
Thank you. Thank you, ma'am. I think that was addressed at you, John, and Gloria.
I don't know about, the cover of Time this week is the alleged abuse of the prosecutorial duties that Mr. Starr has, and I would venture to guess that the tobacco executives don't feel they exactly got good press. But the large, I don't dismiss public opinion at all. I spent most of the columns that I write actually are about public opinion and how they impact on politics. And I think I may have sort of allowed myself to be misunderstood. I don't think that public opinion is to be dismissed in this case. I'm just not sure that public opinion today, Bill Clinton at 79% approval, is likely to be public opinion in May. And having seen a previous president go from 90% to Houston, Texas, and private life, I'm pretty aware of how fickle public opinion and public approval can be.
Gloria, you want to throw it?
Well, no, I mean, I take what you're saying very seriously, and obviously, as a member of the media, I don't think we've dismissed your concerns at all. I don't think tobacco executives were treated easily, nor do I believe that the press is out to get anybody. I think the press is out to get the answers. And I think with all the stakeouts and the Betty Curry picture and all the rest of that, there is this, sort of frenzy during week 1 of the story. And I think now the press is trying to get those answers, and we'll disagree, as we should probably in a healthy society, about whether those answers should come as quickly as I might want them, or as even Ron might want them. So, I sort of, I take what you're saying to heart, but I would say that I think we're just trying to find out what happened.
We're running out of time fast, and there are still a number of people who want to ask questions. So I'm going to ask the questioners to be shorter and the answers to be a bit briefer. Please.
Duly noted. My name is Colin Rule. I'm a first-year student here at the Kennedy School, and I think Matt Drudge probably feels like he just won the lottery. I mean, we're talking about him on the same level that we're talking about the Times and the Post, and it's astounding to me. But my question is, if there had been no Matt Drudge, if there had been no internet, but we still had the 24-hour news cycle and the cable channels, how do you think the breaking of this scandal would have differed?
24-hour news channels?
cycle. The
News cycle.
Yeah.
I'm not sure it would have been that much different if CNN or MSNBC or CNBC got the same information Matt Drudge got. I'm not sure it would be that different.
If you were to make a comparison, for example, of Watergate and this current story, or a series of these current stories, one of the huge differences is the speed with which this story runs as compared to Watergate. Watergate happened, and then the Washington Post was a lonely outpost of reporting for about 6-8 months until CBS did 2 big pieces in November of '72, and it really didn't get going until there were...
New York Times.
New York Times was so late on that. It was pathetic. But it really took a long time. It wasn't before there were hearings in '73 up on the Hill that it had legs to hang on to. It had a source, but it was public and it was on television. And then it just ran to its conclusion.
But maybe the better comparison isn't with Watergate, it's with Iran-Contra.
Iran-Contra.
Iran-Contra was all of the same thing, except for the computers. You know, we had CNN, and things are very much more similar than in Watergate. And this has moved along so quickly, I think, on the basis of the subject matter. This is not about a policy crime. It's about the most explosive thing you could possibly imagine.
Watergate was a pretty easy
internet-
one. You break in.
The internet has changed it somewhat. If you looked at the internet today, someone was sending NandoNet and all of the web newspapers a notice that they should get on the story of the murder of the other White House intern in July of 1997. And it's all, nobody's used it yet, but they give you a reference on the web. You go to the web, it says news, and here's the story about the murder of 3 people at Starbucks in Georgetown, July of 1997.
Right.
One of the 3 was a former White House intern. This story says this murder came right after, 3 days after Isikoff hinted that a White House intern was about to turn state's evidence. The whole purpose, the whole point of the story is to bring a murder into this, and it's all over the web tonight.
Welcome to the web.
I think it would have run a week later in Newsweek.
It would have, yeah.
Agree.
Ma'am?
I'm Anna Perez, and for 12 years I was a government flack in Washington, including 4 years at the White House as Barbara Bush's press secretary, and I'm a Kennedy School Fellow this semester. My question is for Mr. Emanuel. Earlier on, you evinced, it sounded to me like you had a problem with the 90% unnamed sources and all the stories about this issue. Have you ever participated in a story as an unnamed high government official?
Yeah.
And
Absolutely.
what makes it okay for you to do it and for other people not to do it?
I just said the difference between me, and I've said this whether I'm dealing with childcare, healthcare, crime story, or budget story, or anything of that nature, we're dealing with public policy on this issue, which is nonetheless significant. Now, as Gloria says, we've dealt many times. I'll be there pushing for the administration side. You're dealing with grand jury testimony. The solemn oath of that is to protect individuals in the grand jury, all those involved, and that's a legal matter, and they have the code
But
there.
we don't know that, for instance, the information about Betty Curry didn't come from Betty Curry or her lawyers.
No,
we don't know that.
No, wait a second. You do know a couple things on that story. And one most important is a statement put out by her attorney. Second is if you go back to the 15 pages and all the citations in David Kendall's letter, and it doesn't hang on the New York Times story, okay, and it doesn't hang on the Wall Street Journal story, which I think changed today, given where it was on Thursday and their article today, which is quite different than the Thursday article, that in fact it does cite very specifically where reporters, I believe, were doing exactly their job, sourcing their material, saying from the independent counsel's office.
Well, then
and that
I'm
is
sorry.
very different.
Well, I just have one
I've got-
follow-up for Gloria. Is it possible for reporters
there are
then
other
to draw
people
the
that-
line? Is it possible for reporters then to figure out when to use unnamed sources and when not to, based upon Mr.
Look,
Emanuel's?
let me just say, if we could get this stuff on the record, we would. Don't make any mistake about that. If we could get somebody to talk on the record about this, we would, we would be doing that.
Okay.
Thanks, sorry, Martin.
Thanks, pal. Yes, please.
I'm David Hochschild. I'm a student here at the Kennedy School. My question is for Ms. Borger. You mentioned you feel the story is very important, and I suppose my question is, how important is it relative to the other issues that are going on right now? In the last 2 weeks, two major things have happened. Number one, we've deployed 4 aircraft carriers and 200 aircraft in the Persian Gulf, and the prospect of a sequel to the Gulf War seems imminent. Number two, the president laid out a very ambitious domestic agenda with dealing with race relations, reducing classroom size, and saving Social Security. So my question is, how important, even if the allegations are true, are they relative to those issues which I think really affect most Americans?
I guess what I would say to you is that I think we've been covering all those stories. I think that, you know, this week on Face the Nation, we had Madeleine Albright on talking about Iraq, Secretary of State. And I would have to say to you that you can't say we didn't cover the President's State of the Union or the fact that he produced a budget with a balanced budget. And I would say we have covered all those stories. And you've seen in the initial sort of burst, most stories on the front page were full of this because it was the big story. And you will see now today, I believe the lead story in the New York Times and the Washington Post was Iraq and about Saudi Arabia. And so I believe, I know you're smiling at me, but I do cover this stuff. So, you know, I can tell you what we're doing. The cover of my magazine this week was computers was IBM.
Oh, that's, no, you're right.
Not Drudge, right.
My name is Joe Cernelia. I'm what would consider myself a pilgrim in an unholy land. I hail from Newt Gingrich's district in Georgia. And it seemed funny to me that there was journalists, well-respected journalists such as George Will, saying on This Week on ABC that the president would indeed go down in a week from the time of the broadcast, and then there's the White House says nothing about that, which I mean I'm not making accusations at all about that. I was just wondering how, and George Will is a known conservative, how politically driven would this argument be? Like how much does this go along party lines, these accusations? Because of course with Hillary Clinton's vast right-wing conspiracy. That would.
Ron, do you want to answer that whole question?
But I just want to give me the question.
Just how politically driven would the accusations and this entire investigation be? How politically driven would you consider it to be? As far as party lines.
We got it.
Okay, yeah, we got less time than the answer requires. Look, I think let me just try to cite what you said. George Will make a prediction that the president would be down and would be out of office in a week. Going back to, I think, the central tenet here, I think that's where the disconnect starts to occur between the public and the press, is making a prediction, not that it's wrong, but it's trying to reach a conclusion before the facts, and I think that's what the American people are saying. Don't try to give us a conclusion that you're going to drive. Second is, I think that, you know, I think sides have divvied up. I think that's not only in the public, but I also think that's in those who are commenting and looking into it. I have not just a belief, I actually think one of the mistakes that's been done here in the independent counsel's office is that I think Ken Starr's continued political activity while independent counsel has really brought a cloud over his office, and it's his actions that have raised that cloud. It's not mine. I didn't continue those activities. That's the answer.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot. We got 2 more questions. You go first.
My name is Aaron Goldzimmer. I'm a student here. I want you to contrast, if you can, the coverage of this story with the coverage of Iran-Contra, which I personally think involves much more serious allegations. And what I'm afraid of is, will the backlash against the media in this case mean that the Iran-Contras of the future won't receive their due coverage and the investigations that they deserve?
Thank you. Andy Kohut, you were in effect talking about that a moment ago.
Well, from a public response, the immediate reaction to Iran-Contra was the single largest drop in the Gallup poll's presidential approval ratings. Ronald Reagan's rating went from something like 62% to 45% overnight. And your question makes me want to go back and really look at what the differences were in the dynamic of then and now. I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that people's expectations about Reagan were so high at this point, where people have a much more They're much more cynical now, and they're much more cynical about Clinton specifically, so their response couldn't be nearly as dramatic. But it's a good question that I'm not fully prepared to answer, but that's how I see it, just off the top of my head.
But the second point that you raised, I think, is a very important point, and I don't know that there's evidence, but there's a sense that reporters will in fact be more careful about digging into questions such as that. I think so. I don't know that that's going to be accurate.
But you want to make
enough.
sure reporters don't stop doing their jobs
Right.
either, because their
Well, of
job
course.
is to
No,
dig.
of course.
Whether it's popular or not, that's your job. And
Absolutely. No, I agree with that completely.
Could I just add something to that? Because I think what happened was, prior to this story, it had already begun to happen. The Washington bureaus had reduced the number of investigative reporters they had. As a result of this story, they have called a lot of reporters in from as far away as Moscow into the bureaus into Washington in order to get on top of this story. So I suspect what you're going to see, if the public does not become so disenchanted, and I think because the press is moderating its behavior now, they may head that off, that you may see a resurgence of a little more watchdog journalism.
Last question.
My name is Chris Angel. I'm a junior at Milton Academy. My question is to Mr. Kohut. What is the public opinion of the partisan nature of the accusers, and how has that affected the president's approval ratings?
Well, I think the public feels that there's partisanship some partisanship in the accusations, but I don't think that that's the principal. I don't think that that's the principal reason for the public's seemingly rallying to the president's response. I mean, one of the things that impressed me in taking apart these polls is how it's not only partisanship, because if you look at Democrats and independents who've come to judgment about this, their views are every bit as conclusive about what should happen to the president or not happen to the president as members of the other party.
Andy, thank you very much. Our time's up. I want to just make the obvious point. It is very difficult to pull together a panel of this quality as quickly as we did this one. And the person almost single-handedly who pulled this off is Edie Hallway, who's standing off there in the corner. And I just want to thank her very much. And my thanks also goes to Ron Emanuel, who probably got the word this afternoon. Please rush up there because one of your colleagues got sick. Ron, thank you very much. Next time you get at least an hour. You'll get a lot more warning next time. Gloria, Bill, thank you so very much, John, and Andy Kohut for sharing all of this information. And thank you all for coming and sharing this information.
I'd love to do that.
Are you going to cross the way?
Ron, you know what I was, how are you?
I know the name is familiar, yes.
Pretty good.
John? Sure. Hey, how are you? Nice to see you.
I was going to call you this week.
I'd come down to
I was
Washington.
trying to get you that voice from government class.
Now, it's also, part of it is online.
And I was thinking of the week of February 23rd.
That's a good week for me.
Okay.
It's a good week.
When did
I'll go
I
out
take you?
to San Francisco the latter part of that week.
Okay. Why don't you just give me a number?
It's 617-443-99.
Okay, I hope you can too. People dash
extension 31.
Marvin, great job.
Thank you.
.org.
Okay.
That's www. Okay? And come on down. Great article on Saturday. Come back home. I'm actually doing some